Hello, welcome to the Efficio Spotlight on Procurement podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. Today, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by a couple of guests. Marco Forgione, who is the Director General of the Institute of Export and International Trade, and my colleague Ashray Lavsi, who is a principal at Efficio and one of our supply chain experts. And in this episode, we actually wanted to respond a little bit to some recent news that was in the media, particularly around the CrowdStrike IT outage, which was obviously covered an enormous amount in all the media, talked about lots of implications all over the place. One of the things we thought didn't get covered as much was actually its implications on supply chain, which got us thinking about where global supply chains are and the implications of lots of these issues. So we're delighted to have kind of two experts with us today where we can hopefully try to unpick a little bit about global supply chains, challenges to this point, and potentially, I think, some of the stuff that people might face in the future. So gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. As I say, probably a good starting point would be a little bit of context on just generally supply chains. It feels to me as a non-expert that in the last, say, 5 years since COVID, there have been enormous amounts of changes for supply chains. People have been reacting, thinking differently. I'd love to get your perspectives on where supply chains were and where they are now. And is that different? Have things changed, or is it just something I've perceived to have changed? And Marco, maybe if I could start with you on that question.
Sure, Simon, and you're spot on. The global supply chains have been going through a period of unprecedented shift and change. Actually, I think it predates COVID, it predates Brexit. And it was a realization, I think, from all the professionals working in global supply chain and international trade, that the highly efficient, highly effective systems and processes that have been introduced were beginning to really feel the stress and beginning to break. Any complex system eventually falls in on itself, and the integrated global supply chains were beginning to fall in on themselves. So all those involved were looking at reshaping. There was a shock with the UK, with the Brexit vote. That caused some reassessment as to what that would mean. Then we were hit with COVID. You've got then war on mainland Europe, you've got conflict in the Suez Canal, and you've got environmental change impacting some of the key routes, such as Panama Canal, and impacting production, agricultural production. So I think what we're seeing with global supply chain was an attempt in a calm, reasonable way to make adjustments to move from highly efficient but highly fragile supply chains to a resilient, anti-fragile global supply chain. And the process of starting that has then been buffeted almost on an annual, if not 6-monthly basis, by unexpected issues that we've been through: the war, the conflict, environmental change, technological issues, CrowdStrike being but one of them. And so you've never seen, certainly in my memory, things like supply chain and logistics topping the news. But that's where we're at. And unfortunately, I can't see a very quick end to that.
Yeah. And then maybe Ashray, to you. So again, for me as a non-expert, when Marco talks about fragile and non-fragile supply chains, could you bring a little colour to that? What is the difference in really simple terms?
The essence of it, right, is that initially all supply chains were set up for cost efficiency. So when we think of going back a few decades, like lean manufacturing and just in time, it was, okay, less inventory. We just wanted to be less working capital, use it when you need it, reduce cost. What that ended up happening was, okay, the supply chains were extremely efficient, but as Marco put it, very fragile. So any little disruption would break it. Now, with all the black swans that have been happening, and as Marco put it, like almost every 6 months, there's some or the other events. What's ended up happening is resilience has become a big thing. Previously, no discussion about resilience in boardrooms. It was always cost. Now it's, okay, resilience is a big thing in boardrooms, and people have been talking about how do we balance cost and resilience? How do we balance cost and resilience? It goes from one end to the other, right? Because you can't have both. To build resilience, you need to add some redundancy in the system. And to add redundancy, you invariably need to add cost to it. So that's the anti-fragile view as well, in my perspective.
Understood. And then Marco, so I think on this podcast, I'm sure in other places, we've talked a bit before around the implications of things like COVID and Brexit. So I think a lot of people would understand that. But again, as simplistic, if I think about resilience in a supply chain and I don't know, maybe because of factor A, I move more of my supply chains to transportation by the sea and then move it to air freight. And then something like CrowdStrike, it seems to be that even the resilience piece is incredibly complicated because of the sheer number of these events happening at the moment.
You're spot on. And then we're seeing a shift in modal approach, diversification. And to Ashray's point, if you're looking to build resiliency, if you're looking to build an additional capacity, there is cost. There's also storage. So it's not just a single statement of a business changing the way they operate. The whole supply chain, every actor involved has to shift and change. So it's not like flicking a light switch. Instead of sourcing from A, I'm going to source from B. You can't just do that.
Yeah.
The processes, the systems, the infrastructure is required. And as you're building that, what's happened, we've seen another unexpected occurrence, which has then disrupted not just the original supply chain, but the one you were trying to build.
Yeah.
And the implication of that on the global trading system has been, as we've seen, to cause a depression in trade because we're not able to get all the product to the right place at the right time. The delay now moving goods through Suez, you're adding best part of 3 or 4 weeks, but you've then got to deal with the fact that the ships are out of location, they're in the wrong place, the containers are in the wrong place, and you hear apocryphal stories now of traders in China unable to get containers to put their goods in to get them shipped in the first place. Yeah. So the sort of Gordian knot that we're wrestling with is just getting pulled tighter and tighter. You then have to tier on top of that things that are external to the supply chain, but have an impact. So the geopolitics, the shift of the decoupling between the US and China and what that means and how that plays out. All of this has an impact on the global supply chain. Yet supply chain managers, CEOs, boards have no say or control over those. They are exogenous risks, but you have to bear those in mind. The way in which the US has imposed tariffs now and sanctions unilaterally, and the, in inverted commas, potential trade war that's playing out, most of which is in reality a currency war that's being played out, all of which impacts at a time when the supply chains are not stable and people are trying to redesign and rebuild them. And it's causing huge disruption. And it's going to take many, many years to truly unravel the situation that we're in and see what the supply chain 3.0 is going to be in the future.
Yeah. Marco, I guess you must have a fascinating role in your job because I guess you're both interacting and talking a lot to industry and to government. I'd love to explore both sides, the regulatory side and the other side, but just starting on the kind of corporate side, is there a danger that the big organizations are constantly chasing their tail on this topic because they're pursuing one strategy, then they have to change it? How are organizations starting to tackle this unbelievably complicated picture to create resiliency in a perpetually changing world?
First, we're saying that they're trying to do this in partnership, so pulling together. So the large industrial manufacturers, the large businesses have to work in collaboration with not just their suppliers, so their supply chain, but actually the logistics and those who are servicing and getting both the warehousing and also the movement of products, goods, components, and ingredients. So it has to be done collaboratively. It has also to be done in alliance with regulators, regulatory authorities, both national and international, and with policymakers. One of the key points we've been trying to highlight is that because of the geopolitical pinch points that affect the global shipping through things like the Taiwan Straits, the Malacca Straits, Straits of Hormuz, the Red Sea, actually, governments need to be looking at their foreign policy and their diplomatic teams to see how you can reshape supply and production to adjust for what could be constrained routes. So looking, instead of sourcing primarily from Southeast Asia and from Asia, look maybe at the East Coast US, East Coast Central America, East Coast South America, West Coast Africa as trade routes for UK and the EU. With those routes, you have to deal with the issues of sailing across the Atlantic, not necessarily having to navigate through constrained pinch points. The huge investment that's being made in the middle corridor, so the rail route between China through Central Asia and into the EU. I mean, the demand has shot up through the roof. And then, Ash, we were having a conversation earlier about the northern route through the Arctic that Russia and China are collaborating on to open up a new trade route that is available for much more of the year, investment in technology, into a fleet of icebreakers. So we're seeing that there is a collaborative approach at a national and at a business level, but there are forces much greater than any business or any government can deal with that are at play.
Ashray, you're working with clients all the time, talking to them about this issue. What are you advising companies to do to think about?
A lot of times what we've started doing is just doing scenario planning with risks, right? So having thought through, you can never think about all the different risks because some of these things you just can't predict, right? But as much as possible, if you can bottle them down into or distill them down into certain themes and have contingency plans in place, then it kind of helps you, at least you're ready to pull in up a contingency plan if there's certain kind of disruption. The other bits that we've been also working with clients on is to segment your supply chain. So instead of having one supply chain that manages everything, inbound, outbound for all your components, if you segment that down into, okay, these are my critical high-risk components that I need to absolutely have, and building in more redundancy in those supply chains versus, okay, these other components that are more commodity parts, I can buy them from 5 different suppliers, for example, even closer to home. It's going to cost me more, but it's going to reduce my disruption. So if you segment your supply chains, then also you can have more resilience built in your supply chain. So, but that adds complexity. But those are the things that we're working through with clients quite a bit in regards to risk management, assessment, contingency planning, and just having the scenarios ready to go.
Yeah. And Marco, I'm assuming in your role, you interact with the UK government. You talked about that idea of corporations working together, and you talked about some of these very big kind of global corporations. I'm interested in what place does the UK government have in this topic? Should it be doing more? Should it be actively regulating, or should it be for the market to sort out the answers to these problems?
The important role that government can play is as a convener, so bringing together the key actors to inform the approach that UK government can play. And we shouldn't underestimate the power that the UK has internationally to influence and to play a constructive role as a facilitator and enabler of conversation and discussion. It's more important now, again, than it has been for many years. If you look at organizations like the WTO, World Trade Organization, the ongoing challenges and difficulties there, the fact that the US continue to not support the appellate body, which means it's not functioning properly. So the forum that's been created to address global uncertainty, to establish the rules of international trade, the WTO, is at this point rather dysfunctional. We don't have a long-term solution to the e-commerce moratorium, which allows for free, untaxed digital trade. And there are big players, India in particular, who oppose the extension of the moratorium and wish to have their own approach to dealing with taxation of trade in information, so e-commerce and trade. The difficulties that the WTO securing agreement had of securing agreement on fisheries, particularly because of the impact on small island nations, at a time when traditional structures are under greater stress and the diplomatic and political structures are under great stress. Actually, the UK has a really important part to play, and I would encourage the new government, and certainly all the indicators from the conversation we'll be having, that they intend to play a full role in helping to convene and bring together and create an approach that allows the establishment of widely accepted global trading standards and establish rules for global international trade. That's not to say that there aren't additional challenges. The move from the BRICS, the community of nations, which is many more than Brazil, India, China, and South Africa now, the role that they feel they need to play and voice that they have, particularly on issues like the reserve currency. So, there are massive issues, and it's important that government, and the UK government in particular, engage with those conversations and help shape and frame the future of global international trade.
Yeah. Marco, this is a slightly unfair question just because of the sheer scope of it. I'm just interested in your opinions about, as you look forward from here, some of the big issues. You raised some fascinating points to me earlier about the war in Ukraine, for example, and what that might mean in the future. Could you just give us some thoughts on that?
Sure. Just as we're talking about the war in Ukraine, great to see the confirmation of the digital trade agreement between the UK and Ukraine is coming into force. So that will help and support with the trade, in the medium term, hopefully help with the reconstruction and development of the Ukrainian economy once the war is concluded. And the thing is, that war has to be concluded. And wars are only ever concluded through negotiation and agreement. So we need to get to that point sooner rather than later. And if we project forward, the situation where Russia is perceived to be a pariah on the international stage will change, and Russia will come back into the family of nations at some point. And we need to be aware that may not be on the terms that we would expect, it having been through a process of being excluded and with the sanctions not just against businesses, against the nation, but against individuals and businesses operating outside of Russia. Now, the Russian economy has grown significantly over the period of time that the war has been going on for a whole host of reasons. The relationship, the partnership that Russia has developed with China, is developing with India and other nations, means that at the point that the war is concluded and the negotiation of Russia coming back into the family of nations may not be on terms that the West currently imagines it might be. And what does that mean for the global trading environment and the world economy? Because there is very different approach, very different intentions with regards to Russia, China, India as an axis of power in the future versus the fairly anemic growth that UK, EU, and indeed US has managed in recent years. So there's an awful lot. I'm not saying we've got a whole bunch of solutions here, but you can paint a picture, actually, that's going to have an impact on individuals, communities, societies, nations in the future, which will be very different from what has been and where we are now. And that undoubtedly will have an impact in the way in which business takes place.
So, Marco, is it fair, in your view, there's a rebalancing of global trade happening right now?
Yes, a rebalancing of global trade, rebalancing the way in which trade happens, the rules under which global trade takes place, and the production and supply routes for global trade are all changing. And we had a period of stability from kind of like the 70s, 80s onwards, and we built a system, as Ashray was saying, which was highly integrated, highly efficient, ruthlessly efficient. But what we hadn't realized was that in being efficient, we had baked in huge vulnerability and instability. We didn't realize that until a few years back. Now trying to rebuild that new system at a time when so many different forces are coming into play is really challenging. I don't think anyone's got the solution to that, but there's lots of people who are having to grapple with this to try and create something that is stable in the short term, but will have stability, for decades hence. Yeah.
And with that rebalancing, probably a question to both of you. I'll change it slightly for each. But with that rebalancing, is that an opportunity for companies, for organisations? So if they grab this sense of change, is it a competitive advantage? Maybe I'll ask that to you, Ashray, and then to Marco. I'd be interested in your perspective on: is it an opportunity for the UK? You made some interesting points earlier about, just geographically where we're positioned in the world. So, Ashray, to start with you, do you feel like organisations that can deal with this change could benefit?
Absolutely right. At the end of the day, the organizations that can fulfill what the customer needs are going to succeed. And the only way you can fulfill what your customer needs, if you crack the code on how do I fulfill what the customer needs, right? Which is going to be movement of goods, which is going to be all the discussions we're having in terms of resilience building in the supply chain. So the organizations that can solve that puzzle, be it by cost, be it by whatever means, will absolutely grab that competitive advantage. But that would be at a cost, right? It won't come easy.
Yeah. And Marco, is it an opportunity for the UK as an entity?
Yes, we have to bear in mind that about 80% of the UK economy is trade and services. So there's a slightly different approach required when you're dealing with trade and services. There are complexities, difficulties and challenges with that, but there's huge potential. The UK is recognised and admired for our world-leading services. And with regards to the trade in goods, as you've highlighted, just geographically where we're located, to have access, unfettered or free-flowing access, unconstrained by geographic pinch points to the continent of Africa, which has some of the fastest, will have some of the fastest growing economies in the world, to South America, Central America, and East Coast US. I think gives huge potential to reshape our supply chains, to diversify supply routes and allow us to invest, to develop those supply routes in nations where there is a huge potential benefit of a partnership between us and them. So the place we sit, historic links that we have, the determination of the government, the UK government, to look at a growth strategy with an industrial strategy that is integrated fully with an international trade strategy means that there is huge potential, but it takes will and determination. And that's what we need to see. We need to see that from the regulators, we need to see that from government, from policymakers, and we need to see that from business.
Okay, Ashray, that seems like a good place to draw the conversation conclusion. Fascinating discussion. Thank you both so much for your inputs into that. Fascinating to learn more about the complexities of global supply chains and what the future might look like. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.